So we've been trying to keep the introduction short and just so we can stay on time, but it's going to be hard in this instance. I've had the privilege of seeing the next presenter talk on at least 3 occasions. Last night I was trying to remember how many times I've actually seen her present, and I came up with 3, but I think there's actually been more times. GW Pharmaceuticals work with extracted CBD, a cannabinoid from marijuana, to address seizure-related disorders in children. In my opinion, is true Compassionate Use of Marijuana. Now, Alice Mead, the Vice President of U.S. Professional Relations, Vice President of U.S. Professional Relations for GW Pharmaceutical, is much more humble and scientific in her title of this presentation today. But it is truly inspiring work, and I think you'll find it very interesting what they're doing from a pharmaceutical perspective with marijuana and marijuana-related extracts. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Alice Mead to the podium.
So thank you, Patrick and Sue, for inviting me to speak, and thanks to all of you. I know you've been sitting a long time, and I really appreciate your being here. So I'm going to talk to you about something I've been involved with, I hate to say it, for 17 years now, and that's harnessing the therapeutic potential of the cannabis plant and developing it into prescription medications for the benefit of patients. And I'm particularly going to talk about developing a medication for children with terrible types of epilepsies. Let's see if I can make this work. Good. So I want to give just the briefest introduction to GW, because I'm always asked, what? GW? So, GW was founded in 1998 in the UK by Drs. Jeffrey Guy and Brian Whittle, hence the GW, and they had the experience, the expertise, a sort of perfect storm in a good way to be able to conceive, just even conceive and then launch a program that many people in 1998 called ambitious, and actually a lot of people called crazy, which was to develop a range of prescription medications that are developed in accordance with modern medical standards and that are derived from components or combinations of components of the cannabis plant. So, despite our crazy beginnings, we've come a long way. And we now have our first product, Sativex, which is a 1-to-1 THC to CBD. So we've been working on CBD for a long time, way before Sanjay Gupta, if that name means anything to you. Yeah. So it's approved now in 28 countries for the treatment of spasticity and multiple sclerosis. We have research programs going in a number of other disease areas with different cannabinoids. We're working with 36 universities around the world, and we are at the last stage of clinical research in the US for our investigational cannabidiol product in epilepsy. So as I said, we're looking at a lot of different medical conditions, 4 types of epilepsy. We're going to be doing studies in babies who have been deprived of oxygen at birth with terrible consequences. We're looking at schizophrenia, glioma, a type of brain cancer, cancer pain, and of course spasticity and multiple sclerosis. So, Dr. Madras beautifully laid out the importance of the FDA process. This has been built up here and in other countries over 100 years because of public health disasters to protect public health and safety. But what does it give us, that process? It gives us products that are standardized, precisely standardized in composition with batch-to-batch consistency. It gives us products administered appropriately in very defined and reliable doses, which are very important for people with really serious medical conditions. We, as a company, have to conduct a wide range of studies, not just the efficacy studies that you hear about, but lots of other studies, food interaction, drug-drug interaction, so patients and physicians have a lot of data to make treatment decisions. Patients can get their products reimbursed by health insurance. They're distributed through monitored sources like pharmacies. The FDA comes and inspects all the way to the UK to make sure that every step in the manufacturing process is highly, exquisitely quality controlled and manufactured manufacturers are answerable for any defects in their products. Our promotional activities are very limited. We can only promote medical claims that are approved in our label. And these products are now dispensed under the supervision of properly trained and educated physicians and pharmacists. So, okay, enough about the FDA process, but I really want to talk about cannabidiol because there's a lot of confusion about cannabidiol. And I'm going to try to allay some of the concerns and the confusion before I talk really about, I will get to compassionate use, I promise. So, as a couple of speakers have said, the cannabis plant is a treasure trove. It has more than 100 cannabinoids, and they each have their own pharmacology. Actually, it's not a bad thing that there are 100 and something cannabinoids. Each has their own therapeutic potential, either by itself or in combination. Now, interestingly, of those 100 plus cannabinoids, only THC actually has significant psychoactive effects. Now, THC and CBD are the primary cannabinoids, and if you had harvested a field of wild cannabis a couple of centuries ago, before all the breeding, it would have been about half CBD and half THC. But, as Dr. Madras pointed out, CBD is different from THC. It doesn't interact or bind to the body's endocannabinoid receptors, and that's why it isn't psychoactive like THC. It has its own pharmacology. And until recently, there's a lot of press about it now, right? But until recently, it had been bred out of modern cannabis because cannabis had been bred up for high THC levels and all the CBD-containing strains were just discarded. Until, and it's actually a long story I won't tell today, there was sort of a light bulb went on that CBD actually had value. We'd known since 1998, right? It's half of our first product. And then there was a scramble to try to recover CBD-containing strains in the US. So now what's the legal status of CBD? So the Code of Federal Regulations lists all the scheduled substances, not by brand name, but by their molecules. And CBD is listed, so some people say, well, then it's not controlled or scheduled. Well, but it's controlled in Schedule 1 because it's considered a component or a derivative of the cannabis or marijuana plant. And that's true of all those other 100 plus cannabinoids. They're all in Schedule 1, except THC, which is separately listed in Schedule 1. And DEA has made it very clear to us and other companies that regardless where CBD comes from, laboratory synthesis, a high CBD containing strain, or the hemp variety, it's a Schedule 1 substance. So we had to, for example, get Schedule 1 research registrations, that's the DEA word for license, for all of our 50 research sites around the US. And also state Schedule 1 licenses. So here's how CBD came to the awareness of the public. Not through our research. I mean, I have to say, science is so important. We think science should drive policy, but for the media, at least, science is boring. And so they don't really cover it that much, especially when you're kind of quietly beavering away, doing your science, you know, largely out of the view of the public eye. Not on purpose, it's just what we do. So Dr. Gupta of CNN did this program entitled Mead in August of 2013. And in it, he profiled this little girl, Charlotte, who has a terrible type of epilepsy called Dravet syndrome. Charlotte was having hundreds of seizures. She was near death, frankly. And her parents were desperate to find something to help her. Nothing was helping her. And there was beginning to be a little bit of talk in the parent communities. We didn't even know about these parent communities as a company at that time, about CBD. And I said, that's a long story, I won't tell now how the knowledge of CBD came back to the public. But so her mother went to this group of brothers in Colorado who were growing cannabis for dispensaries and said, do you have any varieties that have a lot of CBD? And they said, well, we have this one plant called Hippie's Disappointment. Subsequently renamed. So they made an extract for little Charlotte, and it was a miracle. You know, all shown right there on Dr. Gupta's program. She went from having hundreds of seizures to having a few a month. Well, of course, this created a tidal wave of interest amongst all these desperate parents with similar children. And they began to move to Colorado, and 17 states passed CBD access laws in the space of less than 2 years. It was astonishing. The brothers formed CW, because at that time, originally, it was only available in Colorado, formed CW Botanicals, and now they sell on the internet to virtually all 50 states. And CBD vendors of other sorts are coming up daily, selling on the internet, and they make this claim. They claim that CBD is a legal nutraceutical in all 50 states, and that's why they can sell it on the internet or in dispensaries. So what is CBD hemp oil, and is it really a legal nutraceutical? So tackling the word nutraceutical first. So nutraceutical was a word that was coined in 1989. And a lot of us use it. It's a common word, but it's not a regulatory category. So it's not something that the FDA regulates as such. The FDA regulates prescription medicines, over-the-counter, dietary supplements, food additives, veterinary products. It doesn't regulate nutraceuticals as such. They're usually considered dietary supplements. So let's substitute dietary supplements. Then let's talk a little bit about hemp, because you hear a lot about how CBD comes from hemp. Well, the Controlled Substances Act does not define hemp. It defines marijuana. And then it exempts from marijuana, any kind of marijuana, certain parts of the plant that Congress didn't think had the psychoactive principle. So the stalk, the fiber, the sterilized seeds, and any preparations made from them. So those parts of the plant and preparations from them are not marijuana, so they're not scheduled. But if CBD or any cannabinoid is extracted from those parts, or any part of the plant, that reverts to being marijuana. So there's an exception to the definition of marijuana and an exception to the exception. So, that's why people get really confused about this area. So, and just to point out that the hemp variety of cannabis with roots in the ground is still considered marijuana. So is hemp really a good source of CBD? Well, in Europe and Canada, farmers can grow certain varieties of the hemp strain that have in Europe less than 0.2%, or in Canada less than 0.3% THC. But what most people don't realize is hemp is grown for stalk, fiber, and seeds. It's not rich in cannabinoids. It has very little CBD. It has almost no THC. It has 1 to 2% CBD. Now the ratio of CBD to THC might seem large because there's only 0.2 or 3% THC, but there's not very much CBD, so you need to grow acres, right, of hemp in order to extract meaningful amounts of CBD. Now the problem with that is that hemp is a phytoremediator, and it's used to clean up toxic soils. It absorbs heavy metals from the soil. So you have to be really careful about the cultivation conditions under which the plants are being grown if CBD is going to be extracted. Now you've heard the phrase probably CBD hemp oil or hemp seed oil. So let's talk for a minute about hemp seeds. Hemp seeds are nutritious. They're a good source of protein. They're high in omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. They're used as protein powders and in salad dressings. But what they don't have are any cannabinoids. Like, hemp seeds have no cannabinoids, including no CBD. The CBD or any cannabinoids are in the flowering portion of the plant. That's just where cannabinoids are in any cannabinoid variety. So what happens is that the flowering portion, or sometimes it's mushed up with the whole rest of the plant. An extract is taken, it's a sticky, thick extract, and then it's diluted with hemp seed oil, hence CBD hemp oil. Or it could be diluted with coconut oil or sesame oil or, oil, because cannabinoids don't dissolve in water. So sometimes you'll just hear CBD oil. But the extract itself is just a sticky substance. It's not actually really an oil. The presentation is usually in an oily base. So here's true hemp seed oil that you can buy in Safeway, because we're in California, Whole Foods. It's perfectly legal. Omega-3s and 6s, etc. And then here are the CBD hemp oils, or CBD oils, or sometimes really called hemp oil, to drop the CBD so they can be sold on the internet, but honestly that makes them misbranded, that you can buy. And as I said, there are many, many of these. So what's the FDA doing about this? In 2015 and 2016, the FDA took enforcement action and issued warning letters to CBD vendors who were selling on the internet. And so here's the reasoning. A substance, it could be water, but if it's intended to be used in the treatment, mitigation, prevention, diagnosis, etc. of disease, a disease, then it's a drug and it has to go through the FDA approval process. And if it doesn't, then that product is misbranded. So FDA said, well, you're making these medical claims, we can see that on your internet site, and that makes it a drug, and we don't think you've gone through the FDA process, so it's misbranded. But then the FDA took the unusual extra step and tested these products, and in 2015, half of them had no CBD. Really? This is being used by children with terrible epilepsies. And in 2016, most of them had much less CBD than what was on the label, and more THC, many of them. Then the FDA, this last bunch of warning letters, also said CBD can't be sold as a dietary supplement. Another what? Not on our, well, actually we were surprised too. But all the vendors were like, what? Because there's a provision in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that says that if a substance is being studied in a clinical trial, and the public knows about this clinical trial through a press release, let's say, and there are substantial resources and time involved in developing prescription medications through clinical trials, some other manufacturer can't come along, take that substance, put it in a dietary supplement, and shortcut that whole process. So this provision is sort of a compromise between recognizing how difficult it is to do pharmaceutical development and the need for reasonable access to dietary supplements. Now there's an exception if the substance was already marketed as a food or dietary supplement before the clinical trials started. But FDA looked and said, there were clinical trials in the US in 2006, and CBD wasn't being marketed as a food or dietary supplement before that time. So, now there might have been older hemp oil products sold as dietary supplements. In the 1990s might have had a tiny bit of CBD because they didn't wash the seeds as well back then. But it wasn't marketed as containing CBD. It's just marketed as hemp seed oil. So, and also, if something were overtly marketed as CBD, remember it's a Schedule I substance, so that's marketing in violation of federal law, so that probably doesn't count as lawfully marketed. Anyway, I know that got a little technical, but there's still a lot of confusion out there. So I now want to shift gears and talk about what my colleagues and I actually really do, which is developing CBD medications down the FDA pathway. So we start with a plant, which is pretty unusual for the FDA. The FDA hasn't approved too many plant-based products ever. So we start with very high CBD expressing plants, many times more than the hemp varieties. We have varieties that are consistent from generation to generation in their chemical composition. We grow them under very highly controlled conditions. Every aspect of cultivation is carefully controlled. We extract them with liquid carbon dioxide so there's no residue. Then that gives us the sticky, all the components of the plant, right? And then we put that through an additional purification process to give us crystalline CBD. And we do that because we're studying children with very young developing brains. And there is, as Dr. Madras mentioned, research suggesting in animals that THC can cause seizures. And we know that FDA has concerns about that. So we thought it was prudent to remove the THC. Now, is there really a need for more treatment in epilepsy? We have a lot of epilepsy drugs that have been developed over the last, say, 20 years. But the fact is there are 500,000 children in the US that have epilepsy, and about 30% of them aren't controlled with existing medications. Now that's true actually of adults too, that percentage. It's about 30%. It's sort of an intractable 30%, no matter how many new drugs there seem to be. But with children it's worse, because many of these childhood onset epilepsies have a genetic origin. And so they're just more devastating. These children have, well, and I'll talk more about the two specific kinds. Well, actually, we're studying 4 kinds. You'll see in red Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, or LGS, Dravet syndrome, remember what little Charlotte has, tuberous sclerosis complex, and West syndrome, or infantile spasms. Now, our Dravet and LGS trials are the most advanced, so I'll talk just a little bit about those kids. So they have multiple seizure types and multiple seizures a day. They become cognitively impaired. They need lifelong care. It is a devastating situation for them and their families. A sizable percentage, more than 10%, don't even live out their teens. And they are, as much as 80% of them, intractable to available medications. So they really are in desperate need of new treatment options. This is just some of their pictures. You know, they are in wheelchairs, they wear crash helmets because they fall and fracture their skulls. They often end up in the pediatric ICU, and they're constantly being given tests and EKGs to see if some possible combination of medications might be helpful. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're developing, Epidiolex. And why did we decide to study CBD in epilepsy? Why did we? You know, there are 100 plus cannabinoids, that's a lot of medical conditions. Why did we pair those two up? Well, after Sativex was well underway, we sponsored quite a lot of preclinical, that's animal, mostly rodent research. That's how companies like ours start, to see signals. And we used different cannabinoids in different animal models of different disorders. So we found that CBD and this related cannabinoid CBDV, different carbon side chain, were both strongly anticonvulsant. So we thought, well, that's interesting. Well, CBDV is a more minor, a rarer cannabinoid, and we're really good at breeding up rare cannabinoids in a plant so we can begin a development program. We thought, we'll study CBDV in adults, because that's where companies like ours start, with a more common kind of epilepsy, partial onset seizures. And actually, we're doing that trial right now in Europe. So we were sort of planning to do that, but you know, the best laid plans. So this is August 2012. This is way before Sanjay Gupta, I want to point out. Just to mention we're not opportunists, Sanjay Gupta opportunists. Dr. Guy, one of our founders, got a phone call. I think it was from like the House of Lords, who had gotten a phone call from someone who had a whole telephone tree that went back to this family in California. And they had this boy. This is him last year. His father wrote an article about their experience, but this was a number of years ago, so he was younger. And he had this record, about 90 seizures a day. He'd lose consciousness for 5 to 10 seconds. He wouldn't actually fall over, but it completely interrupted his thinking. He couldn't go to school, and he could, you know, you can imagine 90 times a day. You know, he couldn't ever live an independent life. His parents, like little Charlotte's mother, were trying to find something to help him. And they had tried some of these vernacular products. One batch would help him, the next batch made him worse, and they were pretty frustrated. Well, we didn't even know these children existed, because we were looking at adults. And we certainly didn't know that these families were all connected on Facebook. They not only supported each other, but they shared knowledge and information, and they read everything. So this family read mouse research that we had sponsored that was published in around 2010. And they thought, light bulb, this company has a pure CBD product that was being studied in this mouse research. So they contacted us to see, actually Dr. Guy called me and said, please find out what this family wants. And they wanted to see if their son could get our CBD. So we took this deep breath, because this is a child, and CBD is a Schedule I substance in the US. But we felt terrible once we understood, their predicament. We wanted to do something to help. We did some research and we found out that FDA has regulations, real regulations, called expanded access. FDA actually hates the word compassionate. Expanded access. And it allows patients with serious or life-threatening medical conditions who don't respond to existing medications and who can't be enrolled in a current clinical trial to have access to investigational products, maybe Schedule I, we didn't know, maybe applies to children, probably. So we said maybe this would help you as a vehicle to go to FDA. Your application might be stronger if you could show that your son responded to our CBD. And they said, well, how would we do that? And we said, well, it might be faster because pure CBD is not controlled in the UK to come to the UK. They said, okay, we'll do that. We thought, oh my goodness, okay. So we didn't know any pediatric epileptologists. We were going to study adults. So we had to cold call, essentially, this world-class pediatric epileptologist in London and say, will you take this child you don't know and expose this child to this investigational product you've never heard about, and here are our data. And she said yes. So they arrived over the Christmas holidays. He was having about 90 seizures a day. And in about 2 weeks, he was virtually seizure-free. So, that got our attention, their attention, everybody's attention. And sadly, they had to go back to the US without the CBD. That was the deal, it's a Schedule I substance. But their doctor applied to FDA right away for a single patient, still called an investigational new drug exemption, an IND, just like a clinical trial is called, but under these regulations. And by this time, so 2013, early 2013, we've been doing research with our first product since 2006. FDA knew us. They knew the quality of our manufacturing. We had given them a great deal of toxicology and safety information on CBD as part of our Sativex program. So they actually were able to make a sort of risk-benefit analysis, and they said yes. Whoa. And DEA said yes. And then the doctor did another single patient, and yes, yes. So by this time, we had talked to the families, and we now understood that there were lots of children like this. Not just in the US, of course, but who didn't have treatment options and had horrible, devastating epilepsies. And we really wanted to be helpful. We were still going to do CBDV in adults, but we really wanted to be helpful. So we got together in New York with epileptologists and NIH and patient advocacy organizations and us to see if there could be a path forward. And one physician said, well, this one-by-one stuff is ridiculous and cumbersome. He went to FDA and said, can I do 25 patients? FDA said, yes. And DEA said, yes. Well, that opened the floodgates. Pediatric epileptologists, it's a small world. They all talk. And of course, the patients are on Facebook, and somehow, so does my email. There was a lot of interest. And, 4 more doctors stepped forward and said, can we do it? And, fast forward to today, there are 22 of these physician-sponsored expanded access programs that involve over 500 children with different kinds of epilepsies around the country. And then, so I'm sorry, I'm talking, but I'm not advancing. Well, we went to London, and then, now it's the floodgates. And so then the state government started to call, because they either had CBD access laws, or they wanted to provide CBD to the patients in their state, at least a certain number, So we said, well, okay, the same thing, expanded access, so it's actually implemented by physicians, of course, not by the State Department of Health. And now there are 7 of those programs involving another 400 patients. So now, these data are really interesting. They're not placebo-controlled because at heart these are compassionate studies. But the FDA is pretty strict about the protocols. There are a certain number of physician visits, certain data that have to be collected, certain laboratory tests that have to be done, and pretty much most of the physicians are using the same protocol. So they can put their data together and then they can publish it in journals or make presentations at scientific conferences, so it elevates the knowledge of everyone. And that's been fascinating because of so many different epilepsies represented. We can sort of see if one type seems to respond more than another, which is sort of what led us to add on tuberous sclerosis and infantile spasms. We understand more about interactions with other medications and about side effects. Because nothing is benign, let's face it. CBD may have great therapeutic potential, but it won't work for everyone. And we want to know, what percentage of patients are likely to be helped. What are the side effects? Importantly, with patients taking other medications, what are the potential drug-drug interactions? These have to be carefully supervised by physicians with proper data. So the most recent data were presented at the American Epilepsy Society last December on 234 patients that had reached 12 weeks of treatment. You have to do that, so it's not just a honeymoon effect. And it took that, the submission to AES had been months before, so now there are many more children who are on 12 weeks of treatment, but at the time, it had to stop and write it up. So, and about, again, science is boring, about 47% of them had over 50% reduction in all of their seizures. And the side effects were what we would call mild to moderate, sleepiness and diarrhea in that abstract. Low dropout rates for side effects or lack of efficacy. So in the midst of all of this, now we got the picture. These children have terrible epilepsies and they need more treatment options. So we thought really the only way to achieve that is to go through the FDA approval process, because that's the only way that it doesn't matter what your zip code, what your city, what your state, a parent can go into a pharmacy with a prescription and get the product. So in the spring of 2014, we opened our own IND with FDA. FDA gave us something called orphan drug designation because these are rare conditions for LGS and Dravet, and we now have it for tuberous sclerosis and infantile spasms also. We're doing 4 large phase 3, and these are placebo-controlled clinical trials, 2 in each syndrome. These are the largest clinical trial programs ever conducted in these disorders. We're also doing this whole body of other studies that you never hear about that give us information on food interactions and drug-drug interactions and all of that patients and physicians need, not just the efficacy and safety. We have begun our phase 3 study in tuberous sclerosis and infantile spasms. It's going to begin shortly. The first 2 studies, one in Dravet and one in LGS, have completed and we have results. And again, science can be very technical. So I'll just say, in pharma speak, they were highly statistically significant, which means they were very successful trials. Again, the side effects were sleepiness, diarrhea, reduction in appetite, and tiredness. So both these are the trials, but I think I'll be able to make these slides available. Now, we intend to submit an application to FDA in the first half of next year for approval. If FDA gives us priority review, then that's just an 8 to 10 month review cycle. And there's a new federal law that requires DEA to reschedule a new product within 3 months. So that whole federal process should take a year or less. Now, what will happen once CBD is rescheduled? So as a couple of speakers have mentioned, the DEA recently denied 2 marijuana rescheduling petitions. It did say, though, that it and FDA and the National Institute on Drug Abuse were looking at separately the scheduling status of CBD. It didn't give any timelines for that. And of course, we are going to be applying, so they have to look at it because that's part of our application. So because CBD is a component of the cannabis plant, we don't assume it has no abuse potential. We just know it's not like THC. So we're going to do a whole battery of studies, animal abuse liability, human abuse liability, receptor binding, a whole lot of studies. And we'll put them all together and do something called an 8-factor analysis. It's laid out in the Controlled Substances Act. And then we'll make a scheduling proposal to FDA. And then FDA will look at everything, all the data, and they'll make a scheduling recommendation to DEA. And then DEA will look at the data, and then they will publish a schedule in the Federal Register. So now, what happens to marijuana with all that? Because under the Controlled Substances Act, the general rule is that a substance and products derived from the substance are in the same schedule. So think opium and morphine. are both in Schedule 2. But there is a precedent for differential scheduling. And the best, I have to say almost only example, is THC. THC is in Schedule 1, but a synthetic THC, they call it dronabinol, in a sesame oil in a soft gel capsule, that whole thing is in Schedule 3, branded name Marinol. So it is possible, and I would say probably likely, that if CBD is rescheduled, cannabis will remain in Schedule 1. So I'd just like to close by saying this is a very exciting time. You know, opioids are easy to research. That's why we've had modern opioids for a long time. But cannabinoids are really hard. They're hard to separate, they're unstable, it's just difficult. The technology now is finally there. So we're like 100 years behind the development of modern opioids. But the technology has arrived. And so I think in the near future there will be a number of cannabinoid or cannabis-derived medications for different conditions that are available as prescription medicines. I think our program shows that these products can be researched and developed in the US despite their Schedule 1 status. And we believe it is really essential to research these products and develop them in accordance with modern medical standards, because that is what patients deserve. So thank you very much for your attention.
We have time for questions, so anyone would like to submit some questions? Those are our ushers. The first question is, what does CBD do to cancer cells?
So I'm an attorney, so my scientific knowledge is, has a kind of a shallow base, but we are studying CBD, as I said, in glioma. I'm not completely clear what the mechanism of action, actually, often we don't know what the mechanism of action is, even of approved drugs. We have sort of some ideas, and we are studying, as part of all those studies I talked about, what the mechanisms of action are for CBD in different medical conditions, because the mechanism of action for cancer is likely different than it would be for epilepsy. And we know of at least 5 or 6 different mechanisms of action of CBD, so it's trying to pin it down. That's probably all I can say right now.
How are we doing? Next question. Why wouldn't GW develop Sativex as 100% CBD rather than 1-to-1 CBD with THC?
So back in 1998, because that's when we started with Sativex, when Dr. Guy and Whittle were, as I said, they had a perfect storm of experience and knowledge, and they had done a lot of historical research. Now, the interest in the UK amongst patients was in multiple sclerosis, primarily. And they looked back on historical uses of cannabis extracts, because actually when cannabis was used therapeutically in the 1800s and early 1900s, it wasn't smoked. It was used in extracts and tinctures. They were pretty crude, and they didn't really know what was in them, but that's what they were used. And he determined, and even if you went back, as I said, a couple of centuries to that field of wild cannabis, it was about half THC and half CBD. So while in 1998 there were many people who thought CBD was inert, Drs. Guy and Whittle thought that that was probably wrong. And they thought, why not take advantage of what seems to be an historical reality that this 1-to-1 mixture had therapeutic potential. And actually that's why we started with that in the UK.
Next question. I think is for another presenter or speaker. I'll put the question out there, but I don't think it's appropriate for this, this presenter. One of the speakers reported costs of $10 in treatment for every $1 gained in taxes. Please provide details. I'll submit that question to our group of speakers for the conference and see if anyone can provide an answer to that. Are any of the THC products, I believe, contain the acid THCA?
Well, THC, the cannabinoids in the cannabis plant are in the acid form, all of them. Right? So they have to be something called, well, they don't have to be, but normally they are decarboxylated to produce something like THC. So THCA is decarboxylated to produce THC. CBDA is, and they're usually decarboxylated with heat. Now, CBDA and THCA would have their own pharmacology and their own therapeutic potential. So it would be a different, what I would say, manufacturing process to retain THCA in a product. The process, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the ins and outs in great detail of our process. I'm not sure how much THCA is still in Sativex when it is when we take the extract. But it is a whole, I hate to use the word whole plant, but it is a complete extract of all the active ingredients. But we have a decarboxylation step. So it is possible to have a THC containing medication, but then you have to dispense with the decarboxylation step, and that just makes it into a different product.
Next question, is GW developing THC medicines as well? And does your company believe there's early evidence that THC has medicinal values?
Well, our Sativex certainly is half THC. So we think that there can be circumstances where certain cannabinoid formulation, let's say components or ratios, for certain populations and certain medical conditions, THC certainly has a role to play. We, as I said, remove it from the product we're studying in the US because children have young developing brains. But for adults with multiple sclerosis, it seemed like the one-to-one THC to CBD was a better formulation. So it depends on who are the patients, what condition do they have.
Next question, what processes and procedures will be in place to prevent another Purdue Pharma situation from the mid-1990s in relationship to OxyContin and addiction? How are you planning to track the potential abuse and addiction?
Well, we're certainly, as I said, going to do a whole battery of abuse potential studies on CBD to see what the likelihood of abuse potential is. We're agnostic, frankly, as to whether it has some abuse potential, but it doesn't look like it has the abuse potential of OxyContin or even of pure THC, because it doesn't bind to those same receptors in the brain. So I think the jury will be out until we see those data. If the data suggests that it has abuse potential, well, then we're the first ones to say, you know, there have to be controls in place to make sure that there are no sequelae like what happened with Purdue, although, you know, some of that had to do with the way the product was marketed also.
I don't see additional questions. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.